Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about how the Washington Post created its prize-winning database of police shootings across the country.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. With me in the studio today are two Washington Post journalists, Julie Tate and John Meiskens. Prompted by a disturbing rash of police shootings, the Post decided to find out how many occur each year. The Post's Fatal Force project won a Pulitzer Prize and the National Press Foundation's Innovation in Journalism Award. So thank you both for joining us today. First of all, tell us, what was the impetus for this project?
After Michael Brown was shot by the police, we discovered that the editors in the newsroom wanted to know how often shootings like that occur. And so we quickly figured out that the FBI doesn't track any of that data, and neither do police departments. May be tracking it, but are not sharing it with the public. So we endeavored to start looking for those shootings ourselves. Sort of inspired by Killed by Police, which was doing part of it, but then jumping off from what they did to try to collect more data than what we were seeing online.
And how did you go about finding these incidents?
I worked with another researcher, Jennifer Jenkins, and doing a search every day in Google News to find the incidents, find the different police shooting incidents, as well as looking at social media, looking at Twitter, doing an advanced Twitter search every day, and looking for police department press releases. They often send out information about shootings, and sort of culling all of that together to make sure that they met the parameters that we had set, which was just only shootings by police, rather than including taser deaths or vehicle chase deaths or deaths in custody, which I thought was going to be a little bit harder to track.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but I want to bring John into the conversation. So when did your design team get involved in this project?
Pretty early on. We were involved almost as soon as Julie and Jen started putting data in a spreadsheet. Ted Melnick, who's a database editor at the Post, and I started consulting on the structure of that spreadsheet, but then eventually we decided that we needed something more robust, the Django News app, but we'll get to that later.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how did you go about approaching this, what eventually became a mountain of data? You know, how did you keep track of it so that it was usable later both to the reporters and to the design folks?
Well, I mean, we first put it in a Google spreadsheet, and then we had a, what would you call that? A form, right, to enter all of the data for ourselves to keep track of.
Mm-hmm. And how did you decide what was the definition of armed?
There were a lot of robust conversations of what armed would be. And we couldn't just have it be armed with a gun or armed with a knife. I mean, we had to sort of imagine what the threat level was for a police officer. So we have people who are armed with a cane, with a tree branch, with, a lighter, which was actually a lighter that looked like a gun. And so it was a confusing moment for the police officers. But I think that at some point, we decided to sort of categorize the different types of weapons, but we never used that externally. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so this complication of both what the person who was shot was armed with, or the specific object versus the status, the overall kind of meta category was complicated. So we actually had to create multiple kind of multiple fields in our database to store that. But that was probably maybe the most difficult database design question, actually, to figure out how to, as accurately as possible, represent that in a database.
Right.
And sadly, we all know that eventually there will be a police shooting in every media organization's either state or even community. And so one of the charms about this database and this project that you all built is that every journalist across the United States can use it. So why don't can you walk us through some of these categories that that are available online, and maybe we want to take a look at the website at this point. Who wants the mouse here?
I don't know where. We have a bunch of different categories that we track internally and externally. If you go to the database itself, I'm looking at this. Can you get me back to that overview? You can see what we let you filter on the public database, but I believe on GitHub you get more than just this. So you can see here we're doing obviously gender, we're doing race, we're doing the age of the person, and then this is what John was just talking about. We have it categorized as something that would be perceived as a deadly weapon, a vehicle as a weapon, which again was something that was a internal argument because it was sort of difficult to ever, if a vehicle is driving at a police officer, then it is a weapon, but if they are driving away from the officer, then they wouldn't be armed with a vehicle. And then of course there's the unarmed category, which is something that we spent an enormous amount of time vetting and talking among the large reporting group, like to make sure that we all agreed that these people were unarmed. As the story, as more stories were assigned or conceived of, then that's when these would sort of come up in the design, right? So we did a story on people who were mentally ill, and then now you can filter on that. And then we also did another story about the perceived threat level from the officer, so you can also filter on that. But yes.
No, why don't you scroll down just a tiny bit so people can see the state-by-state map and see that they're, in terms of geography, this is everywhere.
It is. We were worried when we started that we wouldn't be capturing everything, like that maybe the Midwest wasn't going to be as robust in reporting police shootings, but that simply wasn't the case. I mean, every small paper has a story in their town when it happens in their town, so that made our lives, easier. I mean, and the stories, that's how we sort of figured out what to track, because the stories themselves sort of follow a specific formula of, Julie Tate, 48, killed, holding a gun, police department, Middleburg Police Department, and so we knew what we could track because the reporting is actually quite good, with those details.
And how did you decide what fields to keep and which ones to discard, just in terms of the sheer amount of data that you had?
I mean, we have a lot of fields that we still collect all of it. I mean, do you mean what fields to show on the website?
Yeah, I mean, were there any that you discarded, or did you decide to keep every single field that sort of initially emerged in your reporting?
I'm trying to think of fields that we eliminated, that we don't use anymore. There's some that are in the internal database that we don't keep track of anymore, and I can't think of which ones those are right now.
Maybe it was just that comprehensive. Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the takeaways, which I think one of the stories on the website describes the racial breakdown. What was the takeaway from that?
I mean, overwhelmingly male victims, overwhelmingly white. I mean, it sort of mirrors the general population of the U.S. The mental illness was always the most. It still continues to be the most striking to me.
And how often was that a factor?
It's still at a quarter of the shootings. It's just, I found that surprising that it stayed at a quarter from 2015, 2016, 2017. It's just stuck.
So there's definitely a pattern, right? Yeah, the 1 in 4 actually mirrors the percentage of people who will be affected by mental illness in their lifetime. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
interesting.
Was there anything that surprised you as the analysis emerged?
I mean, I felt like I was a little surprised that that the victims were so overwhelmingly white males, but I mean, because our original sort of idea was like, oh, there's just so much like this racial situation.
More Michael Brown?
Yeah, I thought there would be more Michael Browns, but then you guys did that analysis of the percentage, like that a black man's 6% more likely, right? So I was.
Go ahead and explain that.
Yeah, so I didn't do this analysis myself, but the gist of it is that once you adjust for the per capita rates by race, then African Americans are disproportionately likely to be shot and killed.
Shot and killed?
By police, shot and killed by police.
By police, yeah. And you also worked with some college journalists or student journalists. Why did you decide to do that? The Post is a big newsroom. You've got a lot of resources. Were there any challenges there?
I think John Sullivan, who works on the investigative team, works at AU, and so he helped to bring those students in to help with identifying the police officers and sending out FOIA requests or I guess actually not sending out the FOIA request, but when they got the information back, putting it into another part of the database that you made, and you can talk about that student part of the database.
Yeah, so in addition to an admin interface for our researchers to enter the data, I also last year built an interface for the students to use in their particular tasks, which was entering the data about the officers. So that required a custom interface that also included the script that the students were using to call the police departments and ask for the information, and then a form to kind of streamline the workflow there and make it standardized.
I have the utmost respect for Chuck Lewis and the Investigator Project at AU. Is this a resource, or are college journalism students a good resource for other news outlets to think about tapping into? Because there are community colleges and universities literally in everyone's backyard.
I think definitely. They're extremely helpful on this project because we had to confirm with every police station that we were going to be using this name or that name on that 2016 database. And they also were extremely helpful on Kimberly L. Kelly, Wes Lowry, and Stephen Rich's project about police officers who are being rehired after committing different infractions. They were a huge, I don't think that project could have been done without them, with the number of sort of calls that they're making.
Do you happen to know if the student journalists were paid or if they did this for credit?
I think they get credit, but I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. And how did you verify the work that the students did, or did the AU faculty do that?
I mean, how does that work on the internal database? I think that somebody is looking over all the work.
Yeah, I think
that they
John
entered.
Sullivan was looking it over and kind of approving the work. So the data they were entering wasn't going straight into the official database, but it required an additional step from an editor to look it over.
We have that same sort of check for publishing the database on a daily basis. We have an editor, David Fallis, who goes over everything that we put into the record. We used to write narrative sentences for 2015 and 2016 about the incident, so he would read that edit it, make sure that it made sense, and then there's a copy editor who then looks at the whole record as well.
Do you happen to know if the Post works with any other university journalism departments in this same way, or is it only AU?
I think it's only AU. I don't know that there's
I don't know
another
of any
one.
others.
Yeah.
All right, well, you may be hearing from some journalism professors after this. So this is probably a good time to segue to some of the victim profiles so that you can show us the kind of detailed information that you were able to track down.
Okay.
And actually, we want you to talk about how you tracked it down, too. So the first victim is...
Oh, this victim is a woman named Betty Jones. She was inadvertently involved in this shooting in Chicago. She was in the same apartment building where the police officers were looking for a suspect, and when she answered the door, they shot the wrong person.
Wow.
They shot the person not a person they were looking for.
Yeah, day after Christmas.
Yeah. So it's very sad. This sort of shows you how we categorize each incident. So there are probably here, I would say there may be like 50 different, originating incident categories. And this is a domestic disturbance call is what initiated it. And again, that is something that 100% is included in the newspaper reporting about this incident. The police were responding to a domestic disturbance at, whatever address it was. Again, we're always looking at the armed or unarmed status. For this, I included it because it was an accident. We have the threat level would be shoot, point a weapon, threat, that there's a threat, there's an attack, there's movement, but she's an accident. We also track whether or not people are fleeing the police officers. We had a sort of internal discussion about whether or not that's a safe thing for police officers to be doing, to be chasing people, what happens in those types of incidents. So that's why we have that, even though that's not something that's displayed. And then, of course, the name, her race, gender, and we have the exact address and where it happened. For some reason, I guess at some point we were obsessed with whether or not things happened inside or outside, and that's why, that's why we started doing that.
Did you find any trend there on
No.
location of these shootings?
No.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of shootings happen outside, but I don't think that it's particularly, at the end of the day, surprising that they happen outside. Again, this is like what we were talking about the flags that we look at for each shooting.
Happen at night.
Yeah, happen at night.
Because of the darkness, is that ever a factor or often a factor?
More than half of the shootings happen at night.
At night.
They do. But again, I think that, if let's say, I don't think a lot of robberies happen necessarily during the day. So it's it didn't end up being a factor that we ever focused on, right? Because it just didn't turn out to be too surprising. Again, and then we have the body camera, dash camera, and other video. We have this officer charged, which we added in at some point, so we could track that over the course of that first year. The toy or fake weapon, because if you had a toy weapon, you wouldn't be armed, but you would, this would be checked because we had a whole issue trying to work that out. A police officer just doesn't know if a weapon is fake or real. So while they are technically unarmed, we had to represent it in a way that, people could see, okay, there's a toy weapon. Although, toy is probably not the best turn of phrase. Maybe replica would be better there.
How often, you've got alcohol up there, how often is alcohol or drugs a factor? Did you find any trend lines there? I assume that's on the victim's part.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully,
yes.
hopefully not
Yeah.
the police officer.
Yes.
Right.
That is something that is not, I don't think, is reliably collected in news stories. That was something that we originally, I mean, we always click it if we see it, but we originally were like trying to think, okay, would there be, like, is this, like, right, what you're saying, is it a drug problem, is it an alcohol problem? But then in the end, it wasn't sort of comprehensively enough covered in local media for us to feel that it was a reliable thing to track.
And go back up to that little paragraph of narrative. Now, you have 991 of those, correct, for 2015?
Yeah.
So you take all of that information that's in the clickable boxes on the back end and create something. This paragraph is on the published website, correct?
Yep.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But then there's also a sentence, and we can find an example of that on the public website as well. But the database itself actually generates the first sentence, and so it's very standardized and includes most of those top line data points. But it strings those together, kind of Mad Lib style, into a sentence.
It's an algorithm that.
It is.
Yeah.
Wow.
It is.
And it produces that paragraph
No.
So that is the part that's
Oh.
written by.
by a reporter.
So this
Okay.
would say Betty Jones, a black woman, 55, unarmed. We'll show you in a second.
Okay.
And then it'll have this narrative following it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Should we move to the next example?
Sure. If you want to look at Castile.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay. So this is Philandro Castile, who many of you know about. Again, we have this narrative, and the reason why
He was in Minneapolis.
yes, he was
Okay.
in Minneapolis.
Right.
We have the narrative trying to just quickly capture. We could write a very long paragraph about Castile, but quickly capture what happened. And I wanted to include this one because we do have him armed with a gun, because there was a gun in the car, which he told the police officers about. But if you go down further, we don't have him as armed, because he did not pick up that weapon. And so we wanted to represent him as an unarmed person in the database. I mean, and after seeing the body camera video that came out, I think that that's pretty clear. But there was definitely a lot of internal discussion about whether or not we were going to click this box.
Now, I see there that you have listed the law enforcement officer who was involved. And once we get through these examples, we're going to talk a little bit more about the challenges of tracking down the identities of the police officers. Anything else from this particular example, or should we move on to Walter Scott?
Right, we can move to Mr. Scott. So he was a very, I included this record because he was a very sort of early on shooting when because we started tracking in, you were saying March, you were putting together the
this
database.
Interface,
Yeah.
starting in March.
And we didn't publish until July 1st, the full database. But it was super valuable that we were doing it at that point in time, because they wanted to know immediately how many people in South Carolina have been shot by the police. And so this was a record just that made it clear to the newsroom how valuable it was going to be to have this information in-house, because we could just stick that number in the story quickly.
Right.
And I also included him because he's part of the, he was fleeing, and that's something that we spent a fair amount of time going back and back and back to the records when we decided to do that threat level. Why was he shot when he was unarmed and running away? And so this gives us, we can obviously filter the database whatever way we want because of the way John has set it up. So we can look at, unarmed, fleeing, et cetera, and then try to do more stories off of that.
Right.
Right. And again, there's not much else here except that we again have this video and the officers charged, and again more information about the police officers. And then you can just see down here, we also always include all of the sources in the database, so we can go back to each story and make sure that we have everything down correctly.
This is probably a good point for John to talk about, bringing all this data to life and, how you built it.
Okay, so so I think early on in the process, once we had about maybe a month of data in the spreadsheet, we realized that the spreadsheet was we were running up against the limitations of using the spreadsheet. And some of the reasons why we just had so many columns is kind of unwieldy to actually enter data in the spreadsheet and keep things, keep the types of data, and for instance, like the category names we use, we want to keep those consistent so we can accurately count them. A bigger issue was that you saw in the admin interface officers. The problem is there could be multiple officers involved in one shooting, and we needed and multiple police departments involved. So we needed to figure out a way to represent that. And we also we realized we were eventually going to want to store data about those officers and the police departments probably, and who knows what else. So we realized we were going to need a more complex database structure. We also wanted a kind of streamlined admin interface, which we were looking at just now to actually enter the data. So to that pointed me to using Django, which is a framework for writing web applications in the Python programming language. It was actually created in a newsroom at the Lawrence Journal World back in 2005, and it was created for use by journalists, and it still is. It's no longer like the hottest tool out there, but it's still used a lot, and so we use that. The advantage of Django is that it allows you to really easily set up an admin interface like we were looking at. If I was going to write that custom by hand, it would probably take me a month just to write that code. But what you can do is you can, in a kind of streamlined format, specify what your database, the structure of your database, what that looks like, and then you can adapt that into an admin interface. So that's kind of the killer feature there of Django. Once you have that, then you can create a website that shows a list of all of the records we have, and we can have an individual page for each person that journalists around the newsroom can look at. And in many cases, that is exactly what you end up presenting to the public. We decided not to do that, but that was the original tool we built to first of all allow the researchers to enter the data, and then open it up to journalists in the newsroom so that they could do their own simple analysis and find information about these shootings.
And again, this database is an incredible resource for journalists across the country. Let's look at the final designed product, and maybe John can walk us through decisions that you made in how to present us the project.
This was the original user-facing interactive version of the database that we published in July of 2015. I did a little bit of work on this. It was mostly designed and developed by my colleague Kennedy Elliott. And so the first thing we wanted to do with this was to replicate some of the interface that we had built internally. So what we had internally was just a kind of a huge interface that had kind of almost every single field or flag we had in the database, and then a count of all of the number of cases for each of those categories, and then each one of those things was a link you could click on, and then that would filter the list. It wasn't necessarily a pretty way to do it, but it worked, and you could use that to find things more efficiently and spot some initial patterns in the data. And some of the editors, I think, liked that idea, but it wasn't definitely polished enough to just release to the public. So Kennedy was really helpful here in figuring out a much more attractive way to present this. The initial kind of visualization we have here is I think the reason we went for this was we wanted to remind people that these weren't just like data points in the database. These are actually like people that you're looking at.
Could you do a slow roll, John,
yeah.
over one or two so people can get a sense? And this is parsed by month, right? Yeah.
And then, yeah, and so we have, we can filter this by clicking here, and
So John just clicked on mental illness as a factor.
and then you can filter the all of these cases. We also built some other views of the data. So this is a grid map level, kind of abstracted map.
Sort of density of shootings.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there's also a kind of geographic map, and one you can actually zoom in on. But then there's just a list.
So if you keep scrolling down below the filter,
Yeah.
then you get a list of all of the victims
Yeah.
by whatever that filter is.
Yes. And so I don't know if you'll be able to read this, but then this first sentence here is the one that is being generated with code. And then the second sentence is the one written by a human writer.
A human writer. Anything else you want to show us about the presentation?
No, it's pretty simple.
Okay. Let's go on to talk about the challenge of identifying the officers who were involved with these shootings.
So we decided, I guess, in 2016 to pursue that as a project. And Stephen Rich built, who's a database editor at the Post, built a sort of a FOIA machine. It was like an
Auto-generated
FOIA
FOIAs, right.
for the police departments. And so we would enter the data for a record. Pretty often, the police officer is identified in that first story, but only by, Michael Anthony, New York police detective shot Julie Tate. So we would get that information, put it in there, and then he would be sending FOIAs out, I guess, each day, requesting a lot more information on the officer, race, age, how long they were with the department, how long they'd been an officer. We at some point had wanted to figure out how many of those officers were veterans, but that was not
Military veterans?
Military
Okay.
veterans. But basically that story was, we actually did that story in 2015, whether or not they were repeat offenders. We had been seeing in stories, that Michael Anthony, New York police detective, was involved in another fatal shooting 2 years ago. And so that's sort of why we ended up trying to do that the second year, trying to get more information to see what the trends were. And if you had less experience, were you more likely to shoot somebody than somebody with more experience? Is it more a rural issue, an inner city issue? Like, all of that information.
And what trends did you discover along those lines?
That generally, if they had less experience, they were shooting people. That we found that 1 in 5 we didn't get the names of, right? Was that the number? I think that was the number.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Just for whatever reasons, they denied Stevens FOIAs. It was very hard to get the full information on officers. It's still very difficult to get that information.
And why is that? I guess I'll prompt you. My understanding is that some states and communities have laws that protect
Definitely.
the identities of the officers.
Yes, definitely.
And is that widespread, or?
That's a question really for Stephen. I don't know. I think that it is widespread, but I'm not sure. Because that was not my part of the project,
right.
Gathering all of that information.
Were you able to get a sense of how often the police officers who were involved in the shootings were either disciplined or charged?
We do have officers charged. Kimberly Kindy and Kimberly Kelly did a story on that, and then sort of going back historically with how many officers have been charged in shootings. And then we sort of went forward with that in 2015 and 16 with the officers charged. And it's not a huge number that get charged.
Can you give us a sense, maybe percentage-wise? Is it a tenth or a quarter or?
Oh, I would say a tenth.
A tenth,
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Or less.
And how many incidents involve body cams or some kind of video? Either vehicle or body cam, I guess, would be the two sources.
Right. So in the first years, it was about 6% involved body cameras when we did that story. Went up slightly after that. In the second year, of the 1,000 or so shootings, I think it's 139 body cameras. And I don't know if it increases like that because of the scrutiny put on police shootings, or if we're just looking for it harder. It's hard to tell which thing is happening, or if, because people were writing stories about body cameras, then local press is now including that in their reporting. So I can't account for why that's so much higher, 139.
Right.
But now this year, I think we're in August and we're at 62 body cameras. But with the body cameras, that's a data point that we go back and back and back to each record when we're going to do. We just did, a 6-month story. So when that happens,
the 6-month mark in 2017, right?
So when that happens, Jennifer Jenkins and I go back to each record to make sure. Often it comes out later that it was a toy weapon. It comes out much later that the person was mentally ill. It comes out later in the investigation that the body cameras are involved. So we see those numbers sort of going up as we continue to fact check each record.
I think as sort of a protective measure, a lot of law enforcement agencies are starting to require body cameras or vehicle cameras so that they also have a way to sort of check whether the officers, if there was wrongdoing or if it was accidental. So we've got a video of a shooting of a Donald Allen that we're going to show you, and then we'll talk about it.
I think. Hey, sir. Okay, drop the gun, man. We can't do that until you talk to us, man. Don't come any further. Don't come any further. Don't do it, sir. Don't.
I'm taking off the goddamn. Drop the gun! Drop the gun! Drop the gun! Do it now!
Wow. So first of all, tell us, how did you get the video?
We requested it from that police department, I believe. That's what we requested. Many of those videos that we got back about 21 of the videos. Some would be posted online, others we requested from the police departments. We were denied more than half the time, which had to do with state laws. Kimberly Kindy did an incredible analysis of each of those states, like laws from each state, whether or not they had to release the videos. And in many cases they do, but then the police would deny the release because of, a continuing investigation. Like once the investigation is over, you'll receive the video.
Were you ever able to, if it was denied, did you try other avenues, perhaps the victims' families, if there was
the victims' families
involved?
The victims' families don't gain access to it either until the case is resolved. So, so it was sort of a complicated story. We felt lucky to get the number that we did.
And are they, all the videos that you were able to get, are they posted online with each victim?
No. We had 21 videos, but I think that those were the best quality videos. Often the videos are very bad quality and you can't see what's happening on the video.
Is it noted in the field whether there was a video or not? Like if a journalist from another organization saw that video was clicked,
is that on GitHub? The body camera?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
But I mean, that's something that we should check because I think that you make a good point that we're definitely keeping track of it. So, I mean, we should make that available to people if they're interested in getting the video.
So this database is a living document. Talk about what you did in 2015 versus 2016 and 2017. How did this evolve over the 3 years that you've been doing it?
Do you want to talk about that, design-wise?
Sure. So we've continued to add more fields that we're tracking to the database, and we've also.
What's an example of that, John, of fields that you added sort of when you realize, oh, we need to have that information?
I think one of those was the fleeing field.
The threat level.
The threat level field, and then adding the whole different categories of tracking information about the officers. We wanted to have a way to track that and to represent that in the database. So we updated the design in 2016, and Kennedy Elliott was again heavily involved in the redesign of this. But there's some new features like we do mention which officers were involved in the entry for the record there, and we also have a whole section that's later, it's further down on the page, that shows the requests we've made.
Wow. Wait. Let's stop there. 1,033 requests filed this year.
Yeah, it's amazing work.
Yeah.
And
you said many of those are auto-generated, FOIAs?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you know how his process works on how he gets the FOIAs?
No, I only know as much as he asked me for this. Steve would tell me what types of data he wanted to store in the database. So I designed a database for him to enter that data. But yeah, I wasn't involved with actually filing those.
I love that transparency, by the way. You can see the reporting process evolving right there in that number. Right.
So so we got 579 pending there, 103 that were denied.
Denied.
That's that's 10% denied.
Have you found over the 3 years that the information has been more forthcoming from police departments or law enforcement, I guess we should say?
I mean, my part of dealing with the database is really looking at all those clips and entering the information. I find that those clips are much more robust. The reporting is much more robust now than it was in 2015. It's like what I was saying about body cameras. I think because people started really talking about it, reporters on the ground were really tracking it. I think that reporters have put a lot of pressure on police departments to release the name of the officer who was involved. And I don't think that that is just I just don't think it's an accident. I think that that this captured the American consciousness, and reporters have made our lives so much easier. Like, in terms of gathering the data with the work that they do.
And John, has the presentation evolved at all, or did you sort of stick with what you built in 2015?
So there was a kind of major redesign in 2016. We kind of mostly kept that design in 2017. So the main way it changed was we made it less of just a page with a long list of names, and we wanted to kind of spend more time talking about what this means. So we added a little section below that first number that shows you just some statistical insights that you might be looking for in the data. We still have.
So what could you read those, since it's it'll be small for people to read. We've got state.
So that first
gender.
one is.
Go ahead.
So the first one is just about how many names of officers. So it's a quarter of the cases, and also, again, as we were discussing mental illness, in a quarter of the cases, half the victims were white, while a quarter were black. Just under a third of the people killed in police shootings were under age 30. So also that language is dynamic, and it is based on the data as it updates, but it hasn't really, those kind of stayed stable.
So quick snapshots.
Right,
of trend lines.
And then there's a similar filter interface to what we had in 2015. It's a little more streamlined than what we had. And we don't have like a long list, but you can page through the records here. And I wasn't actually involved in all the design decisions for this. I think it makes it a little more mobile friendly because it's not overwhelming to your tiny screen to have 900 names on there. But then also we have some additional storytelling elements like this chart comparing this year to last year. The powerful thing there being how steady the rate has been. You can't even really see last year's line because it's right behind the 2015 line is right behind the 2016 line there. And then we also have the map.
Yeah, it's actually quite remarkable. In 2015, there were 991 police shootings you found. In 2016, there were 963, and the 2017 trend line is on track to top 900 again.
We can scroll down and see that on this 2017 page. Yes.
It's remarkable.
I think it looks to me like we might be up this year, a little bit up from where we are right now.
Let's talk about the impact. So you published this. You knew ahead of time that the FBI didn't have any information this robust, and so what was the outgrowth of this project? I know that there was an impact from the FBI, and maybe there were other impacts that journalists would want to know too.
Well, the biggest is that the FBI vowed to start tracking the shootings and track more details than what we're tracking about the shooting. And I think they also vowed to track, should be tracking non-fatal shootings as well, which is not a number that we could ever get at, but is a number that we're very interested in knowing, as what the comparison between non-fatal to fatal would be. And I mean, what would you say other impacts were? There
was, I think, an impact in the a lot of other outlets like wrote about our database and used our data. So
Texas collects, like Texas newspapers collect their own data now, as well as a couple Midwest papers. Los Angeles Times does their own database, which we rely on for the tracking in California shootings. And so we have seen a lot of that.
But yeah, one thing is other journalists and academics using our data. And so an important thing to note there is we wanted to make sure people could use it and also kind of add an additional layer of transparency. So whenever we publish our database, the data is updated also in a spreadsheet that's available through GitHub. And on that file, you can actually see all of the changes that have been made. So you can go back through and see every single change we've made to the data.
It's a huge record.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could see, like, oops, they armed somebody, but then they figured out they were unarmed. So that's, I mean, I guess that's interesting for people. It made me extremely nervous to have that out there because you want every record to be perfect when you enter it. But it was a real learning experience for me that, okay, we can change it, we'll update it in real time, and people will hopefully understand that we're human and mistakes happen, but we're trying every day to make sure that it's the most correct data set that it can be.
Right, so it really is, as I said, a living document, and there are 3 years worth of data in there. Is there an anticipation that you'll keep this going?
To be determined. I mean, it doesn't look like the Justice Department is going to finish their pilot program of how they're going to track the data. So, I mean, we sort of wavered back and forth if we would collect it this year, and then I think we were all very relieved that we were collecting it when the Australian woman was killed in Minneapolis. Like it sort of exploded again, and people wanted to know immediately, like what we were talking about before, accidental deaths. Where are we? Like if we weren't still collecting it, we wouldn't really have any context to offer that story.
And is this technology or the work that you've done, is it being used elsewhere in the Post newsroom?
Well, this specific, a lot of the same technology is used in other projects. A lot of the reason we can do this is because our engineering team has a nice way to deploy web applications like this just for different audiences, so like just inside the newsroom, so it's secure. And it makes it pretty easy to roll out new changes as we make updates to the database. So we use that technology a lot. And we've also used Django on some other projects, including like just one example was we used a similar setup for our election pages for each individual state. We wanted to have some custom text there and some information. We used a similar Django app to do that.
You mentioned an engineering team, which brings me to the Post has an engineering team. A lot of newsrooms do not have that kind of bandwidth. So what resources do you suggest journalists in smaller newsrooms turn to try to create this kind of project themselves? I know you mentioned Django.
Yeah, so Django is definitely a great open source project, but there's a learning curve to that. You need to know how to code, and you need to have the computing resources and engineering resources to deploy that web application, which you may not have. Some of this is certainly doable with Google Spreadsheets or Excel, but that has drawbacks that we discussed with the size of the data. But certainly a lot of great data work can be done simply in a spreadsheet.
Well, thank you very much. This is obviously an incredible resource for journalists and the public as well. So thank you for being with us. Today we've learned how to meld good old-fashioned reporting with technology to produce award-winning journalism. Our thanks to Washington Post journalists Julie Tate and John Meiskens. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.